Even before Yanukovych's win in the presidential elections, there seemed to have been an early declaration of victory, and not from either of the then two remaining candidates, but from Moscow. Sure, the voters trounced the incumbent president out of office on January 17th, but viewing the Ukrainian elections through this perspective fails to give credit to, in some senses, the true victor of this winter's elections, whether or not one likes the outcome or not, and that is the Ukrainian people who held, according to OSCE, impressive elections, which met most OSCE, that's Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and other international democratic standards. And when you get right down to it, the fact that the election results in both rounds were not preordained is a success in and of itself. The fact that voters didn't know who would win is really a relatively rare concept in that part of the world, in what you might call the former Soviet Union, and really puts Ukraine in stark contrast, certainly with its neighbors such as Belarus and Russia. Moreover, it's hard to imagine many post-Soviet countries removing an incumbent president. Think Central Asia, think Lukashenko, think Putin, Medvedev, whoever. As an OSCE election observer in quite a number of countries, I've observed more than one sham election, including the bad ones in Ukraine in 2004. And these elections in Ukraine and the three before that, as David mentioned, compare very favorably with the vast majority of elections in the post-Soviet region. And even, I would say, favorably to some in some of the newer EU countries, such as Bulgaria and Romania, which held elections over the course of the past year. International observers from the OSCE called the vote high quality after the first round and good or even very good after the second round, notwithstanding the problem areas that Judge Fouté and David already discussed. An overwhelming 95% of the some 700 OSCE observers representing 45 countries assessed both the voting and the vote count as either good or very good. And you really can't do much better than that. And I'll be glad to show anyone interested afterwards the forms we used that the observers filled out. They show that there was a methodology here. They were assessed very carefully with statisticians and all that. Forms were sent in from all over the country. So these were not by any means just strictly subjective assessments. So the OSCE observed in more than 2,000 polling stations in every oblast and also observed several hundred vote counts in each round. And all of the various international observers, including IRI and I think UKK, as well as a lot of the domestic observers, pretty much reached the same, more or less the same conclusions about the conduct of the election process. But more importantly than the international observers in ensuring a clean election, that there were sufficient checks and balances domestically. First and foremost, you had representation from the various candidates at all levels, election commission levels, the district level, and in each precinct, including an even number from both the frontrunners in the runoffs held just last week. And this made for some interesting times as we saw ourselves in Odessa, especially when you had tie votes. Moreover, you had party and candidate observers in the vast majority of polling stations, plus you had, in many stations, domestic, nonpartisan observers. So sometimes you'd even enter a polling station and when voting was light, and you'd see more observers of various stripes than voters themselves. That was not unusual. Bottom line is you had plenty of folks watching each other, which doesn't ensure perfection, but it sure helps diminish the possibility of violations. So the election results, I think, in the OSCE determined did reflect the will of the people. Of course, these elections weren't perfect, and frankly, I don't blame Yulia Tymoshenko for contesting the results or asking for a recount in some of the electoral precincts or districts. To do so is not inappropriate on her part if there is evidence of fraud. On the other hand, Ukraine, hard hit by the global crisis, can't afford more months of infighting and political uncertainty, and that also may have motivated some of the European leaders as well as President Obama to sort of issue the statements they did congratulating Yanukovych. Is you had a lot of unclear provisions in the election law and these last-minute court decisions. It did contribute to electoral day confusion. I saw this in a number of polling stations. It wasn't necessarily they were doing anything wrong, but they just, didn't know who to listen to, the courts or the Central Election Commission. And some of these decisions, as Judge Fouté indicated, came on the very eve of the election itself. One that wasn't mentioned, you mentioned homebound voting, you mentioned the last-minute amendments, changing the rules in the middle of the game. But one was adding to the voter lists, and this caused some bad blood on the election commissions. Basically, on the eve of the first round, you had a last-minute court decision that was rejected almost immediately by the Central Election Commission. Mind you, this is like the day before the elections, and this led to confusion being applied to voters who wanted to be included on the voter lists on the same day. There was the ability to do that. OSCE and others have highly recommended that a unified election code be adopted before holding the next elections. And that there needs to be greater clarity in election law. That's a must. That's perhaps the most significant thing I think that they can do. International observers did reach the conclusion there was no massive fraud and that these violations were not systemic or systematic. Also importantly, and I think David touched upon that, the violations came from both sides. And this stands in sharp contrast to the bad elections in 2004 where they only came from one side. Of course, good elections alone don't make a democracy. Ukraine, as we all know, despite all the failures of the Orange Revolution, has developed an open and pluralistic political system. Media freedoms have expanded, but Ukraine's also witnessed poor governance, plenty of corruption. It still remains pervasive and widespread. The destructive infighting, especially between Yushchenko and Tymoshenko, and political instability. What you've had as a result of that is policy paralysis. So the new president and all of the political leadership, including the opposition, which will most likely be led by Yulia Tymoshenko, will need to resolutely further economic reforms, work with the IMF, tackle corruption in the underdeveloped judiciary. That is a key problem, and stabilize the fractious political system. And I think nothing would be more important to strengthen Ukraine's independence, especially its energy independence, and to reduce its vulnerability to outside pressures, read Russia here, which still views Ukraine, of course, as part of its sphere of influence, and Ukraine's efforts to integrate with Europe. And that's something that even Yanukovych talks about. We'll see what happens with that. But there are some favorable indications that he may not be as pro-Moscow as everybody thinks he is. Stay tuned. So I think Ukraine will neither become a total Russian puppet, although Tymoshenko would have been more decisively Euro-oriented, and won't revert to authoritarianism because you do have that political pluralism. There will be a strong opposition. It's not Russia. And even the Regions Party is not monolithic. And many of the oligarchs, or some of them at least, see their future in Europe. And I think that's important to note, and that will affect politics in Ukraine. A major challenge is to develop a system that isn't constantly paralyzed over the authority of the President, Prime Minister, and Parliament. And just to conclude, and I'm sure Larry will talk more about this later, but the U.S. has a solid record of standing with the Ukrainian people over the decades in their support for freedom and democracy. That crosses party lines. It's in Congress, it's in the executive branch, and now certainly is not the time to give up on them, and I'm confident that we won't. Thanks.